At her granddaughter's wedding, beneath crystal chandeliers and polite applause, a 72-year-old grandmother read the 5 words printed on her name tag. And by Monday morning, one quiet decision would change the balance of power in her entire family. At her granddaughter's wedding, beneath crystal chandeliers and the soft swell of a string quartet, a 72-year-old grandmother looked down at her name tag and read 5 words that quietly rearranged her entire understanding of her place in the family. The old lady who paid for this wedding. Not grandma. Not her actual name in gold script like everyone else's. Not beloved matriarch. Just a role. A function. A funding source. I want you to sit with that image for a moment. A ballroom glowing with candlelight. White roses cascading from tall centerpieces. Champagne glasses catching reflections like tiny stars. Guests adjusting tuxedos and chiffon shawls, laughing, stepping into what is supposed to be a celebration of love. And in the middle of it all, a woman who has buried her husband, raised a son, written tuition checks and mortgage assistance checks without fanfare, running her thumb along the edge of a cardstock that does not smudge, does not soften, does not apologize. It is easy to miss the violence of something that is printed politely. Welcome to Empathetic Story. If you are new here, I need you to understand something about me. I have always been drawn to family stories, the kind that don't explode in dramatic arguments but unfold in subtle shifts of tone, in omissions, in carefully worded jokes. I am fascinated by the moments when dignity is tested not through shouting, but through suggestion. And when I first heard about this wedding, this name tag, this grandmother who did not react, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not outrage. Recognition. Because humiliation wrapped in elegance is one of the hardest things to confront. Before we go any further, I want to ask you for one small thing. If stories like this matter to you, stories about boundaries, respect, and the quiet recalibration of power within families, please take a moment to subscribe. It helps this channel continue exploring the emotional landscapes that so many people live through but rarely speak about. And I promise you, this story does not end where you think it does. Now let me tell you what unsettled me most. She did not remove the tuck. She pinned it to her navy dress, the one her late husband once said made her look dignified, and walked to table 12 near the back of the ballroom. Not hidden but not visible either. A strategic placement, whether intentional or not. Close enough to be present. Far enough to be forgotten. If you have studied family systems the way I have, if you have watched how roles calcify over time, you know that moments like this are rarely accidents. Programs are printed. Seating charts are approved. Designs are reviewed. Someone saw those words and allowed them to be distributed across linen-covered tables. Was it meant as a joke? Perhaps. But here is the question I cannot stop asking. When does humor become hierarchy? The grandmother had written the largest check for the wedding 6 months earlier. She had sat at her kitchen table with chamomile tea growing cold beside her and told her granddaughter sincerely that every bride deserves one perfect day. She meant it. Love in her generation was demonstrated through sacrifice and steadiness. You did not announce your contribution. You made sure everything ran smoothly. But that night, her contribution had been announced for her. Publicly. Permanently. Printed in gold. As the bridal party entered and applause rippled through the room, she clapped. Of course she did. Her smile was steady, practiced over decades of family gatherings where composure functioned as quiet armor. A few guests glanced at her name tag. One raised an eyebrow. Another shifted uncomfortably. No one said anything. That silence is important. There are humiliations that scream. And then there are humiliations that sit politely against your chest while waiters pour sparkling water and pass bread baskets down the table. The second kind is more complicated, because it allows everyone else to pretend nothing happened. I keep imagining her lifting her water glass, feeling the coolness steady her, while her son stands across the room greeting colleagues, his tuxedo perfectly tailored, his champagne glass never empty. I imagine her daughter-in-law glowing in pale lavender, smiling brightly for every camera, not once looking in her direction. Do you see it? This is not just about a name tag. It is about positioning. It is about how easily generosity can be reframed as obligation. How quickly a matriarch can be reduced to a line item in a budget. As someone who spends an uncomfortable amount of time observing family dynamics, I have noticed a pattern. The person who gives the most often speaks the least. And over time, their silence is mistaken for consent. Their consistency becomes infrastructure. Their presence becomes assumed. But assumption is dangerous. As the father of the bride, her son, stepped onto the stage and thanked colleagues, friends, and in-laws for their unwavering support, he did not mention her. Not once. The omission was louder than the printed words. And still she did not stand. She did not confront. She did not remove the tag. Instead, something inside her shifted. I believe there is a particular clarity that arrives when humiliation is wrapped in politeness. It sharpens the air. Slows time. It forces a reckoning not with anger, but with structure. That night, beneath chandeliers and camera flashes, she began to see a pattern she had once dismissed as coincidence. The holidays when she was asked to arrive later than everyone else. The emails that included her only when a payment deadline approached. The subtle narrowing of her role from matriarch to financier. Patterns are quiet at first. They repeat gently. Then they solidify. I want you to stay with me because this is where most stories would turn explosive. This is where someone would make a scene. But that is not what happened. She finished her dinner. She applauded the toasts. She watched her granddaughter dance, radiant and unaware of the undercurrent shaping her grandmother's thoughts. And when the evening ended, she removed the name tag carefully, without bending it, and slipped it into her clutch. Paper travels well. Evidence travels quietly. As she drove home through dim streets, she replayed the evening not with tears, but with sequence. Arrival, observation, confirmation, preservation, decision. That last word is the one that matters. Decision. Because by the time Monday morning arrived, this story was no longer about a wedding. It was about dignity, about leverage, about the difference between love and access. And if you have ever given without question, if you have ever assumed that generosity guaranteed respect, I think you will recognize what she chose to do next. By the time she drove home that night with the folded card resting quietly in her clutch, the real question was no longer what had happened at the wedding, but what had been happening for years without her fully naming it. This is the part of the story that fascinates me most because it moves beyond a single incident and into something far more subtle. The quiet contract that forms inside families and is almost never spoken out loud. I have spent a long time thinking about how generosity functions across generations, especially in families where financial stability exists. In many American households, particularly among women who came of age in the 1960s and 70s, love was not demonstrated through constant verbal affirmation. It was demonstrated through reliability, through sacrifice, through writing checks without announcing it, through showing up early and leaving quietly. That generation learned that dignity meant not demanding recognition. You supported your children. You helped with tuition if you could. You assisted with a down payment. You paid for piano lessons. And you did it because family was not a transaction. It was a structure. But here is what complicates that structure. When generosity is consistent, it slowly begins to resemble obligation. This grandmother had wired funds for law school years earlier. She had helped secure her son and daughter-in-law's first home by covering a significant portion of the down payment. She had paid for her granddaughter's summer programs and private lessons. None of these actions had come with contracts attached. No repayment schedules. No public announcements. She had never required her name on a plaque. In her mind, this was simply what stability allowed her to do. She had managed her late husband's estate carefully. She had invested wisely. She had ensured that her family would have opportunities she and her husband once worked decades to build. Supporting them felt like continuity, not charity. But somewhere along the way, something imperceptible shifted. The language around her involvement changed. Early on, she was consulted about traditions, about family recipes, about holiday rituals. Later, she was contacted primarily about logistics, deposits, deadlines, wire confirmations. The warmth did not disappear entirely, but it narrowed. Inclusion began to feel procedural. I want to be very careful here, because I do not believe entitlement always begins with malice. Often it begins with comfort. When someone has always said yes, the possibility of no stops being considered. This is the psychological layer that I think most people miss. When generosity flows steadily in one direction, it creates an invisible pattern. That pattern becomes infrastructure. The giver becomes reliable to the point of predictability, and predictability over time can erode perceived value. There is a concept I often reflect on called the unspoken exchange. It is not about money. It is about recognition. The quiet understanding that says, I support you, and you respect my place in this family. No one signs this contract. No one drafts it. But it exists. In her case, I believe she assumed that her financial support reinforced her role as matriarch, that it ensured proximity, that it affirmed her presence at the center of important milestones. And for years it may have seemed that way. But the wedding revealed something different. When a person is publicly identified not by name, but by contribution, it reframes their identity. It subtly communicates that their value is tied to output. And when that reframing happens without acknowledgement, the unspoken exchange fractures. I do not think she felt betrayed in the dramatic sense. I think she felt clarified. That is an important distinction. There is a kind of pain that shatters you, and there is a kind that rearranges your understanding. She experienced the second. As she replayed the months leading up to the wedding, she likely remembered the tasting sessions where she nodded approvingly at extravagant dessert displays, the email threads that grew shorter and more transactional, the way her involvement seemed most urgent when invoices were due. None of these details alone signaled disrespect. Together they formed a pattern. Patterns are what change perspective. I have noticed in my own observations of families that generosity without boundaries often creates a false sense of permanence. The giver believes their position is secure because they are essential. But essential is not the same as appreciated. There is a profound difference between being needed and being valued. When you are needed, your function is highlighted. When you are valued, your identity is honored. I suspect that what unsettled her most was not the money. It was the realization that her function had become more visible than her personhood. And yet, she did not immediately assign villainy. She did not label her son or daughter-in-law as cruel. Instead, she began sorting facts from assumptions. She examined her own role in the dynamic. That level of self-examination requires courage. It is easier to say they wronged me. It is harder to ask, where did I allow a pattern to solidify? This is where the story becomes deeply instructive for anyone who has ever given without condition, because the absence of boundaries is often interpreted not as kindness, but as accessibility. Love may be constant, but access, if never defined, becomes assumed. I think about how many people, especially parents and grandparents, confuse financial support with emotional closeness. They believe that by funding milestones they are securing inclusion. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they are simply reinforcing convenience. That realization does not require anger. It requires clarity. As the grandmother sat in her quiet home in the days following the wedding, reviewing her accounts and planner with steady hands, she was not plotting revenge. She was reevaluating structure. She was distinguishing between love and leverage, between affection and access. The wedding did not create the problem. It exposed it. And once exposed, the quiet contract she had been operating under was no longer invisible. It was time to decide whether it would remain unspoken, or whether it would be renegotiated on her terms. Once she understood that the quiet contract had shifted, the next decision was not whether she had been hurt, but how she would respond to that awareness. This is where the story moves into territory that I find deeply instructive, because it challenges one of the most common myths about strength. We are conditioned to believe that empowerment requires immediate reaction, that if you do not confront disrespect in the moment, you have somehow surrendered. But what she demonstrated was something far more nuanced. Restraint can be strategic. I used to think silence meant weakness. I associated it with avoidance, with swallowing pain, with pretending something did not matter. But over time, as I have watched how power actually operates inside families, I have come to see that there is a difference between silence born of fear and silence born of calculation. When she left the reception that night, she was not suppressing emotion. She was sequencing information. There is a kind of internal discipline required to do that. Instead of replaying the evening through the lens of humiliation, she replayed it through the lens of structure. Who approved the design? Who spoke publicly? Who omitted her name? Who noticed and said nothing? That is not the behavior of someone collapsing under embarrassment. That is the behavior of someone collecting data. The fact that she carefully removed the name tag and placed it in her clutch rather than discarding it tells me everything about her mindset. She did not need an audience. She needed clarity. The card was no longer just an object. It was evidence of positioning. Evidence of how she was being framed within her own family narrative. I find that detail incredibly powerful because it reframes the moment. It transforms a humiliating artifact into a point of leverage. When she arrived home, she did not call her son in tears. She did not draft an angry message. She opened her planner. She reviewed the schedule. She looked at the final disbursement arranged for Monday morning. That alone tells us something important. Her generosity had always been structured. She had not handed over everything at once. She had staged the payments. Prudence in this case became protection. What strikes me is that she did not reinterpret the entire family history through a lens of betrayal. She did not rewrite decades of love. Instead, she isolated the present pattern. That emotional precision is rare. It requires the ability to feel something deeply without allowing it to distort every prior memory. By Monday morning, she had already decided that any response would be procedural, not emotional. At 8:58 a.m., she called her financial advisor and requested a temporary hold on the final transfer. The language she used was calm. She did not say, "I was disrespected." She said she needed additional review before authorizing the remaining funds. This is where silence becomes strategy. If she had confronted them at the wedding, the focus would have shifted to her reaction. People would have remembered the scene, not the cause. By waiting, she ensured that the focus remained on the structure itself. A pause transfer is not dramatic. It is deliberate. It signals reconsideration. And reconsideration is powerful. When her son called later that morning, confused by the hold, he attempted to frame it as a misunderstanding. I imagine his voice careful, slightly strained, perhaps still assuming that the flow of support would resume once clarity was provided. But she did not fill the silence for him. She allowed it to stretch. Then she offered a sentence that still lingers with me. Public labeling invites private evaluation. There is no accusation in that statement. No raised voice. But it establishes cause and effect. What I find remarkable is that she did not justify her feelings. She did not list sacrifices. She did not recount the years of tuition payments and mortgage assistance. She did not argue that she deserved gratitude. Instead, she recalibrated access. In many families, financial support is treated as emotional proof. If you stop giving, it is interpreted as withdrawal of love. She refused that equation. She maintained her affection for her granddaughter. She maintained her commitment to honoring agreements. But she refused to allow automatic continuation without acknowledgment. This is where delayed consequence becomes transformative. When something we assume is permanent pauses, our perception sharpens. We begin to examine what we took for granted. The hold on the final payment did not destroy the wedding. It did not humiliate anyone publicly. It created space. Space for reflection. Space for conversation. I believe that space is often more disruptive than confrontation. If she had shouted, the family could have dismissed her as emotional. If she had cried, they could have comforted her without examining themselves. But a pause transfer is harder to categorize. It demands explanation. It demands accountability. I also want to acknowledge something personal here. As someone who has observed countless family stories, I have noticed that older women are often underestimated when it comes to strategic thinking. There is a cultural stereotype that aging equates to fragility. But she was not fragile. She had navigated probate court. She had managed investments. She had structured an estate. She understood timing. Her silence was not emptiness. It was preparation. Strategic restraint does not mean suppressing pain. It means choosing the moment when action will carry the most weight. By separating the event from the response, she preserved dignity on both sides. She did not stain her granddaughter's memory. She did not create public fracture. She chose alignment over eruption. And that is what makes this part of the story so compelling to me. Because it challenges the idea that power must be loud to be effective. Sometimes the quietest decisions shift the entire dynamic. The wedding night had revealed the pattern. Monday morning began the recalibration. And the family, perhaps for the first time in years, was about to experience what it felt like when the most reliable source of support decided to pause and reconsider. And when the flow of money paused, something far more significant than a bank transfer was interrupted. The illusion that her generosity was automatic. I want to tread carefully here because conversations about money inside families are often uncomfortable. We are taught to see financial support as kindness, as blessing, as proof of love. And in many cases it is. But money also carries symbolic weight, communicates trust. It signals endorsement. It reinforces roles. When it moves without question, it becomes invisible. When it stops, even temporarily, it becomes unmistakably visible. What happened after she placed that hold was not dramatic in appearance. There were no raised voices echoing through the house. No threats. No ultimatums. There was simply a shift in control. The final installment for the wedding had been structured as conditional upon completion and satisfaction. That word satisfaction had seemed routine months earlier. Standard language in contracts. Technicality. But in this moment it transformed into leverage. Leverage is often misunderstood. People associate it with manipulation. But in its simplest form, leverage is the ability to influence an outcome because you hold something of value. She held the final release. And instead of wielding it aggressively, she framed it as review. That distinction matters. When the venue contacted her daughter-in-law about the delayed payment, confusion rippled outward. It is remarkable how quickly attention sharpens when expected resources do not arrive on schedule. Questions that were never asked before suddenly demand answers. Her son's phone call was polite but edged with urgency. He needed to understand whether something had gone wrong. And I imagine that, in his mind, he expected reassurance. An easy clarification. A smooth continuation. Instead, he encountered steadiness. She did not accuse him of disrespect. She did not recite a history of sacrifices. She did not dramatize the wedding night. She stated calmly that she was conducting a standard review before authorizing the remaining funds. When he pressed gently, asking whether this was about the printed card, she did not retreat into emotion. She connected the two with precision. Public positioning, she implied, has private implications. I find this moment powerful because it illustrates something many people struggle with. Separating feeling from structure. She may very well have felt hurt. But she did not argue from hurt. She acted from position. Money in this context was not punishment. It was a pause button. I think about how often family members assume continuity. If a parent has always helped, they will continue to help. If a grandparent has always covered expenses, they will continue to cover them. The brain craves stability. It predicts future behavior based on past patterns. When the pattern breaks, even slightly, the psychological impact is disproportionate. The pause created space for reconsideration. And space can be unsettling. What I admire most is that she did not frame her decision as retaliation. She did not say, "You embarrassed me, so I am withholding funds." She framed it as alignment. She needed to ensure that the relationship and the financial support reflected mutual regard. That framing is sophisticated. Later that week, when her daughter-in-law came to speak with her in person, the environment itself told a story. They met in her home. Not a cafe. Not a neutral location. Her living room with its polished wood floors and sunlight filtering through sheer curtains. Territory carries subtle authority. It reinforces ownership, history, continuity. She offered tea. Her daughter-in-law declined. That small detail lingers with me. Hospitality extended. Hospitality refused. It felt like a metaphor for the larger dynamic. When the conversation turned to the delayed payment, the daughter-in-law focused on logistics. Deadlines. Vendor expectations. Timing. But she avoided the emotional center of the issue. So the grandmother gently placed the name card on the table between them. Objects can speak without raising their voices. She asked a question that I consider one of the most effective in moments like this. Can you explain the humor? There is something revealing about requiring someone to articulate intent. Jokes often rely on shared understanding. When asked to explain, they either deepen connection or expose imbalance. The response she received was predictable. It was meant to be lighthearted. Everyone knew how generous she had been. It was simply acknowledgment. But acknowledgment framed as labeling is different from gratitude expressed as respect. She did not argue. She did not attack. She clarified. Generosity without respect becomes transaction. And she did not participate in transactions that diminished her. I find that sentence extraordinarily instructive. It reframes the entire conversation. The issue was not money. It was dignity. By positioning her as the one who paid, the family had narrowed her identity. She widened it again by insisting on conditions. Conditions are often misunderstood as threats. In reality, they are definitions. They outline what is acceptable and what is not. When she explained that the final payment would be released upon formal acknowledgement and assurance that such public positioning would not happen again, she was not escalating. She was recalibrating. Recalibration implies adjustment, not destruction. Her daughter-in-law had not anticipated conditionality. She had anticipated continuation. That is what makes leverage so powerful when used calmly. It interrupts assumption. I want to pause here and acknowledge something personal. Many people fear that tying money to respect will appear petty, that it will look like control. But there is a difference between weaponizing resources and aligning them with values. She was not demanding praise. She was demanding recognition of personhood. As the conversation ended and her daughter-in-law left, there was no dramatic victory. No triumphant declaration. Just a subtle shift in posture. The balance of the relationship had moved away from automatic entitlement and toward negotiated respect. The funds had not yet been released, but the dynamic had already changed. And that, to me, is the essence of this part of the story. Power did not return through confrontation. It returned through structure, through clarity, through the quiet assertion that generosity is a choice, not a role to be assigned. The wedding may have been beautiful. The flowers may have been flawless. But beneath that polished surface, something foundational had been corrected. And for the first time in years, the family was beginning to understand that access to her resources would now travel alongside access to her dignity. What shifted in that living room was not simply the status of a payment, but the tone of the relationship itself. And that shift demanded a deeper conversation than logistics could ever resolve. By Sunday afternoon, the atmosphere felt different. Rain tapped steadily against the kitchen windows as her son and daughter-in-law arrived, standing a little closer together than usual, as if proximity might reinforce unity. I have always found it telling how people physically arrange themselves before difficult discussions. Bodies reveal what words try to conceal. She had set 3 coffee cups on the table before they arrived. Not 2. Not as host and guest. 3. Equal placements. Equal weight. That detail matters to me because it signals something intentional. This was not a confrontation. It was a negotiation of structure. Daniel began by speaking about harmony, about how misunderstandings should not overshadow milestones. His tone, I imagine, was measured, almost diplomatic. He framed the past week as tension that needed smoothing. It was an attempt to reduce the situation to miscommunication rather than misalignment. She did not interrupt him. She let him finish every sentence. That kind of listening is not passive, it is strategic. It allows the other person to reveal how they are framing the issue. When he was done, she placed the folded name card at the center of the table and asked him to read it aloud. There is something profoundly different about hearing words spoken in a quiet kitchen compared to seeing them printed beneath chandeliers. In the kitchen, stripped of music and applause, the sentence felt smaller, more literal, less clever. He read it slowly. She did not ask him how it made him feel. She asked him what it communicated. This is where the conversation deepened. Rebecca tried to soften it. She explained that it had been affectionate recognition, a playful acknowledgement of generosity. But here is the nuance that struck me. She defended intention rather than addressing impact. And that is where so many family conflicts remain unresolved. People hide behind intention. I didn't mean it that way. It was just a joke. Everyone knew what we meant. But impact does not dissolve simply because intention was benign. The grandmother responded without anger. She said something that I believe redefined the entire dynamic. Love may be constant, but access to my resources is conditional. That sentence is not dramatic. It is architectural. It separates 2 concepts that families often fuse together. Love is emotional continuity. Access is operational permission. By disentangling them, She removed the automatic link between affection and financial support. I remember the first time I heard someone articulate a boundary that clearly. It unsettled me. Not because it was harsh, but because it exposed how often we rely on vague expectations rather than defined agreements. In families, we assume that love equals unlimited availability. She was calmly saying that assumption was no longer valid. Daniel's posture changed as the words settled in. There is a moment in difficult conversations when defensiveness begins to thin and recognition replaces it. He admitted that he had taken her support for granted. Not maliciously, he insisted, but habitually. Habit is powerful. It disguises entitlement as normalcy. She did not attack him for that admission. She did not demand dramatic remorse. She clarified what she required moving forward. Acknowledgment without deflection, and a clear understanding that public positioning of her role would not be reduced to a financial function again. This is where I think many people misinterpret boundary setting. They assume it must be loud to be effective. But the strongest boundaries are often delivered in even tones. No trembling. No raised voices. Just clarity. Rebecca for the first time shifted her language. She said she had underestimated how the gesture would be received. That word, underestimated, carries subtle deflection. It implies miscalculation rather than responsibility. But the grandmother did not dissect it. She accepted the shift as movement in the right direction. What she was doing in that moment was recalibrating hierarchy. Hierarchy exists in every family, whether we admit it or not. It is shaped by age, by resources, by personality, by history. For years, her generosity may have quietly reinforced her position. But the wedding revealed that her authority had been reframed as utility. In this conversation, she restored authority without hostility. She explained that the final payment would be released once there was written confirmation from the venue, and a clear acknowledgement of the misstep. Not a performative apology. Not a grand display. A direct recognition of impact. There is something profoundly dignified about that. She did not require humiliation in return. She required awareness. As they spoke, the rain outside intensified briefly, streaking the glass with thin lines that blurred the view of the yard. I imagine the kitchen growing quieter, the initial defensiveness dissolving into something more honest. There were no declarations of lifelong gratitude. No dramatic embraces. Just recalibration. By the end of the conversation, shoulders had lowered. Voices had steadied. The air felt different. When they left, she did not feel triumphant. She felt aligned. That distinction matters to me. Triumph implies defeat on the other side. Alignment implies correction. On Monday morning, she authorized the final transfer. The funds left her account as originally intended. The wedding remained intact. No vendors were penalized. No public scenes unfolded. But the dynamic had shifted. In the weeks that followed, invitations arrived earlier. Conversations included acknowledgment. Her presence felt less procedural and more personal. It was not perfection. It was awareness. And awareness, once established, rarely disappears. As someone who pays close attention to family stories, I find this part of the narrative deeply hopeful. It demonstrates that boundaries do not have to fracture relationships. They can refine them. They can transform unspoken assumptions into spoken agreements. She did not demand to be centered. She demanded to be respected. And in doing so, she reminded everyone at that table that generosity is not an identity to be assigned. It is a choice to be honored. That Sunday afternoon was not about a name card anymore. It was about restoring balance. And sometimes restoring balance is the most loving act of all. After the funds were released and the immediate tension dissolved, what remained was not resentment, but a redefinition of roles that would quietly shape every interaction that followed. This is the part of the story that stays with me long after the wedding, long after the kitchen conversation, long after the rain against the windows. Because what she ultimately restored was not control over money. It was clarity about identity. When she said, "Love may be constant, but access is conditional," she was not drawing a line in anger. She was drawing a distinction that many families avoid for decades. And I find myself returning to that distinction again and again, asking what it means in practical emotional terms. In American culture, especially within financially stable families, There is often an unspoken belief that parental love extends indefinitely into material support. College tuition, first homes, weddings, even business ventures. These gestures are framed as blessings, as investments in the next generation. And they are. But somewhere between generosity and expectation, something fragile can fracture. What she recognized, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, was that her love for her granddaughter had never required proof through money. It had been expressed through presence, guidance, memory, and continuity. The checks were extensions of stability, not substitutes for affection. But when the family system subtly began treating her financial support as infrastructure rather than choice, the distinction blurred. Her access to resources had become assumed, and assumption is the quiet soil in which entitlement grows. I do not believe her son or daughter-in-law set out to diminish her. That would make the story too simple. What unfolded was more common, and perhaps more unsettling, gradual narrowing. Over time, her role had been compressed into function. Necessary, appreciated perhaps, but no longer actively honored. When she recalibrated, she was not demanding center stage. She was insisting that her identity not be reduced. I have watched this dynamic unfold in many families. The parent who consistently provides begins to feel peripheral in emotional decisions. The grandparent who funds milestones becomes a reliable background presence rather than a respected voice. And because there is no overt cruelty, the shift can go unnoticed for years, until a moment crystallizes it. For her, that crystallization happened under chandeliers. But the real correction happened in quiet conversations and procedural adjustments. By separating love from access, she restored something foundational: agency. Agency is the ability to choose rather than react. When generosity is assumed, agency erodes. When generosity is acknowledged as conditional, agency returns. In the weeks following the Sunday conversation, the change was subtle but real. Invitations were extended earlier. Details were shared more openly. Gratitude was expressed more directly. Not extravagantly, not performatively, but consciously. That is the power of recalibration. It does not rewrite history. It reshapes future patterns. I find it important that she did not withdraw affection from her granddaughter. She did not allow this lesson to stain the joy of the wedding. Her love remained steady. That steadiness, in fact, reinforced her authority. It demonstrated that boundaries were not punishments. They were principles. There is a misconception that boundaries create distance. In my experience, poorly communicated boundaries do. Clear boundaries often create respect. They clarify expectations. They remove ambiguity. They prevent quiet resentments from accumulating. What she did was model emotional maturity in a way that transcends age. She did not weaponize her resources. She aligned them with her values. And I think that alignment is what makes this story resonate so deeply. It challenges the narrative that older women should be endlessly accommodating, that they should absorb discomfort to preserve harmony. She preserved harmony, but not at the expense of dignity. I have heard people say that setting conditions around money makes relationships transactional. But I would argue the opposite. When money flows without acknowledgement, the relationship becomes transactional by default. When expectations are named and respect is required, the relationship becomes intentional. The recalibration also reshaped how her son perceived her. He had likely always viewed her as steady, reliable, generous. Now he had to view her as discerning, as someone capable of pause, as someone who would not allow her role to be defined by convenience. That shift in perception matters. It reestablishes equilibrium between generations. And perhaps most importantly, it sends a message beyond the immediate conflict. Aging does not mean relinquishing authority over your own narrative. It does not mean accepting reduction. It does not mean allowing yourself to become invisible within the very family you helped build. I think about the small wooden box in her desk drawer where she placed the folded name card. Not as a relic of bitterness, but as a reminder of awareness. The card no longer held sting. It held context. Context is powerful. It allows you to understand not just what happened but why it mattered. In the months that followed, there were likely still moments of tension. No family becomes flawless overnight. But the underlying structure had changed. The assumption of automatic access had been replaced by negotiated respect. And that is what this part of the story teaches me most clearly. Love does not require self-erasure. Generosity does not require silence. And boundaries, when delivered with steadiness, do not fracture families, they refine them. She did not become colder. She became clearer. And clarity, in the long arc of family history, may be one of the greatest gifts a matriarch can leave behind. And once clarity settles into a family system, the real lesson is no longer about a single event, but about the structure that event revealed. When I step back and look at this entire story, not just the wedding, not just the paused transfer, not just the Sunday conversation, I see something far more significant than a dispute over money. I see a quiet correction of hierarchy. I see a woman refusing to let her identity collapse into utility. I see dignity reasserted without spectacle. What stays with me most is this. Humiliation does not have to be loud to be costly. It can be subtle. It can be printed in gold script. It can be framed as humor. But when it reduces a person to a function, it reshapes how others perceive them. And perception inside families becomes reality if left unchallenged. She challenged it, not with outrage but with structure. I think about how easily this story could have taken a different path. She could have erupted at the reception, creating a scene that overshadowed the bride. She could have swallowed the discomfort and allowed the pattern to continue unchecked. She could have withdrawn completely, severing connection out of pride. Instead, she chose something far more difficult, measured recalibration. There is a maturity in that choice that deserves attention. As someone who has spent years listening to family stories, I have learned that the most painful conflicts rarely revolve around money itself. They revolve around meaning. Money becomes the surface expression of something deeper. Respect, acknowledgement, inclusion, hierarchy. In this case, the money was never the central issue. It was the symbol of how she was being positioned. And once she recognized that, she understood that the real negotiation was not financial. It was relational. Respect costs nothing to offer. It does not require a check. It requires awareness. It requires language. It requires the refusal to reduce someone's identity to their contribution. And yet, when respect is withheld, even casually, it carries a price. I want to speak directly to anyone listening who has ever felt quietly repositioned within their own family. Maybe not through a name card. Maybe through an omission. A joke. A pattern of being contacted only when help is needed. These experiences accumulate. They rarely explode. They settle into the background until one moment clarifies them. When that moment arrives, you have a choice. You can react impulsively, satisfying the immediate surge of emotion. Or you can respond deliberately, reshaping the pattern at its root. She chose the second. And in doing so, she demonstrated something I find profoundly important. Boundaries are not acts of aggression. They are acts of definition. Definition clarifies who you are and how you expect to be treated. Without definition, others will define you by convenience. Over the course of this story, we watched a shift from assumption to acknowledgement, from automatic access to negotiated respect, from silent giving to conscious alignment. That shift did not destroy the family, it strengthened it. Because here is the truth many people avoid. Relationships built on unspoken expectations are fragile. Relationships built on articulated boundaries are resilient. I also think about the generational implications. Her granddaughter witnessed none of the conflict directly, but she will grow up in a family where roles are clearer, where support is intentional, where respect is not presumed but practiced. That may be the quietest and most enduring legacy of all. The folded name card resting in a small wooden box is no longer evidence of humiliation. It is evidence of awakening, a reminder that even in later years, identity remains negotiable, authority remains possible, agency remains intact. There is something deeply empowering about that, especially for women who have been socialized to equate self-sacrifice with virtue. Self-sacrifice without boundaries is depletion. Self-sacrifice with clarity is generosity. She did not stop giving. She redefined how giving would function within the family. And that, to me, is the heart of this story. It is not about revenge. It is not about winning. It is not about teaching someone a lesson through punishment. It is about recalibrating power quietly enough that dignity is preserved on all sides. If I had to distill the lesson into something simple, it would be this. Generosity should travel in both directions, not always financially, but emotionally, verbally, relationally. Gratitude must be expressed, not implied. Roles must be honored, not reduced. When you sense that your contribution is being treated as entitlement rather than gift, pause. Observe. Clarify. Define. You do not need spectacle to restore balance. You need steadiness. In the end, the wedding photographs remain beautiful. The cake was served. The music played. The funds were transferred. From the outside, nothing appears broken. But beneath the surface, something essential was corrected. And perhaps that is the most powerful kind of change, the kind that does not announce itself, but quietly alters the foundation on which a family stands. Sometimes the loudest lessons are delivered in silence. And sometimes the greatest act of love is insisting that love and respect stand side by side. That is why this story lingers with me. Not because of the insult but because of the response. Not because of the money but because of the meaning. Respect costs nothing. But when it is missing, the price is always paid somewhere. And she decided, calmly and deliberately, that it would no longer be paid by her dignity. This story was never truly about a wedding, a name tag, or even a delayed bank transfer. It was about something far quieter and far more universal. The moment a person realizes they have slowly been reduced to a function instead of honored as a presence. The grandmother did not explode. She did not humiliate anyone in return. She did something far more powerful. She paused, reflected, and recalibrated. In doing so, she reminded everyone around her that generosity is a choice, not an identity assigned by others. Love may remain constant, but access, influence, and participation in someone's resources must always travel alongside respect. What makes this story profound is not that she held money back, but that she restored balance without destroying connection. She protected her dignity without burning the bridge. She proved that strength does not have to be loud, and that boundaries do not have to be cruel. The deeper lesson here is simple but transformative. When you give without clarity, people may assume without malice, but assumption still erodes respect. If you feel quietly repositioned in your own family, do not rush to anger. Observe the pattern. Define your boundaries calmly. Align your actions with your values. True power is not in retaliation. It is in intentional recalibration. Now I'd love to hear from you. If you were in her place, would you have paused the final payment, or let it go? Please share your perspective in the comments, so we can learn from each other's viewpoints. And if stories like this resonate with you, subscribe to the channel to support more thoughtful, emotionally intelligent discussions in the videos ahead.